The stagecoach came barreling into Dust Creek, Nevada on a Thursday afternoon in the summer of 1878, trailing a plume of red-brown grit that hung in the air like a warning, and every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing to watch it come. But none of them were prepared for what stepped down from it when the door finally swung open. Her name was Julia Kendrick, and she was 23 years old, and she wore a dress the color of deep water, silk and taffeta layered over a corset that had clearly been stitched by someone in Boston or New York who had never once considered what the Nevada Territory might do to fine fabric. The dress had a small train that dragged across the rutted earth of the main street and immediately gathered the dust of 1,000 cattle drives into its hem. She wore white gloves that went past the wrist, and her dark hair was pinned beneath a hat that boasted a feather from some bird that absolutely did not live within 500 miles of where she was standing. She was carrying a carpetbag in one hand and a hat box in the other, and she stood at the bottom of the stagecoach steps and looked at the town of Dust Creek with an expression that was not quite horror and not quite defiance, but somewhere between the two, like a woman deciding whether to cry or fight. Dust Creek was not a pretty town. It sat between two dry hills in the high desert, and it consisted of roughly 40 buildings, most of them wooden and most of them in need of paint. There was a saloon called the Rusty Nail, a dry goods store run by a widow named Mrs. Pierce, a blacksmith, a livery stable, a small post office, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's office, a boarding house, and a sheriff's office that also served as the jail. There was a church at the far end of the street that got used on Sundays and for funerals. That was about it. The nearest proper city was a 4-day ride north into territory that was still being carved out of the desert by men with ambitions larger than their common sense. The stagecoach driver, a leathery man named Pete who smelled permanently of horses, tossed Julia's 2 large trunks down from the top of the coach with a complete absence of ceremony, and they landed in the dust with 2 enormous thuds. "End of the line, miss," Pete said, and then he climbed back up and cracked his whip and the horses moved on, because the stage did not stop for long. Julia Kendrick stood in the street and looked at the trunks and then looked at the town again. A dog crossed the street in front of her and disappeared between 2 buildings. 3 men sitting outside the saloon were staring at her without any apparent self-consciousness about it. A woman peering out of the dry goods store window pulled her head back when Julia's eyes found the glass. "Are you lost, ma'am?" The voice came from beside her, and she turned. Homer Boone was 31 years old and stood 6 feet and 1 inch, which meant he was taller than most of the men in Dust Creek, but not the tallest, that distinction belonging to a Swede named Lars who worked at the sawmill. Homer was broad through the shoulders in the way that comes not from vanity but from years of actual work, and he had forearms that showed the corded muscle of a man who spent his days doing things that required strength. His face was weathered and honest, not the handsome of a city man, but something better than that, the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and thought, and the particular kind of patience that the desert demands. His eyes were a pale gray-green, like sage under morning light, and they were looking at her now with a directness that was not rude, but was absolutely not looking away. He was wearing a dark work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, worn canvas trousers, and boots that had seen better decades. His hat was brown and wide-brimmed, and had been shaped by sweat and rain into something that was entirely its own thing now. At his hip, he wore a Colt single-action Army revolver in a plain holster, which was not unusual for the Nevada Territory in 1878, where the law was sometimes an hour's ride away and sometimes further. "I am not lost," Julia said, and her voice had a Boston accent that sounded like something from another planet in the middle of the Nevada desert. "I know exactly where I am. I am in Dust Creek." "Yes, ma'am, you are." He paused. "Did you mean to be?" It was a fair question. "I did," she said, and then she squared her shoulders inside that magnificent, impossible dress and said, "I am here to take over my uncle's ranch. Julia Kendrick was my uncle. He died 6 weeks ago and left the property to me." Homer Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he removed his hat, which was a gesture of respect, and he held it against his chest. "I knew Elias," he said, and something in his voice changed when he said it, went softer around the edges. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Kendrick. He was a good man." "He was," she said, and her chin lifted just slightly, and he could see that grief was something she was keeping under tight control, behind the defiance in her eyes. "And I intend to keep his ranch going. His foreman wrote to say the crew is still there, and there are cattle that need managing and the spring repairs haven't been done yet, and I intend to see to all of it." Homer put his hat back on slowly. He looked at the silk dress and the white gloves and the extraordinary hat and the two large trunks sitting in the dust, and he looked at the woman wearing all of it, and something shifted in the expression on his face, not amusement, exactly, and not pity, but something that was perhaps the beginning of respect for something that hadn't yet earned it but showed every sign of intending to. "The Kendrick place is 4 miles out," he said. "I've got a wagon at the livery. I can take you and your things out there if you'd like." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because Elias Kendrick let me run my cattle on his south pasture for 2 summers when my own land was drought-struck," Homer said simply. "And because you're standing in the middle of the street with 2 trunks and nowhere to go, and that feather on your hat is about to attract the attention of my horse." She turned and looked. A large bay horse tied to the rail outside the livery was indeed extending its neck toward her with great interest. Something crossed her face, the ghost of a smile, chased off almost immediately by the effort of maintaining composure. "I would be grateful for the ride," she said. His name was Homer Boone, and he owned a modest cattle ranch of his own about 2 miles east of the Kendrick property, which was called the Circle K, though Elias had always said he hated the name, and had inherited it from the man he'd bought the land from. Homer had been in Dust Creek for 7 years, having come from Texas originally, from a small hard-scrabble town in the hill country that he didn't talk about much. He was not a man who talked about much in general, but he wasn't cold about it. He was the kind of quiet that comes from having thought a great deal about things, and having decided that most of those thoughts were private. He loaded her trunks into the wagon bed without asking for help, and without making a show of the effort, and he handed her up onto the wagon seat with the careful formality of a man who had been raised to treat women with particular consideration. And then he climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they drove out of Dust Creek to the northwest along a road that was more suggestion than fact. The Nevada Territory in summer was a thing of violent beauty. The desert spread out around them in colors that shifted between gold and rust and the deep green of the sage, and the mountains in the distance were purple against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the air smelled like hot dust and something wild that Julia couldn't name but would later come to think of as the smell of freedom, though she didn't know that yet. "You've come a long way," Homer said. "From Boston," she confirmed. "I know. Elias talked about you sometimes." She turned her head to look at him. He was watching the road, the reins loose in his hands, his whole posture the easy confidence of a man who has driven wagons through harder country than this. "What did he say?" "That you were smart," Homer said. "That you'd studied at a women's college back east, that you had more grit than most people gave you credit for." He paused. "And that you'd never been west of Pittsburgh." "Pennsylvania," she said, and there was something wry in her voice now. "He wrote to me every year. He was the only family I had left, really. My parents died when I was 17. He'd left Boston before I was born, went west when there was still wild country to find." She looked out at the landscape, at the sage and the endless sky. "I always thought I would visit someday. I didn't expect it to be like this." "Like what?" "Like inheriting a ranch I've never seen, in a place I've never been, with cattle I've never met." "The cattle aren't much for introductions," Homer said, and that was the first time she heard him make anything resembling a joke, and she found it landed somewhere warm in her chest. The ranch appeared over a low rise, and even with Elias gone and the grief of that fresh in her heart, Julia felt something stir in her when she saw it. The house was a solid two-story affair built from lumber that had been hauled a long way, with a wide porch running around three sides and windows that caught the last of the afternoon light. Behind it were a barn and several outbuildings, and the fenced pastures beyond were dry but had the bones of good land, and in the near pasture she could see cattle grazing in the long shadows of late afternoon. There were two men sitting on the porch steps who stood when the wagon rolled up, and Julia saw them register the silk dress and the hat, and exchange a glance before they came forward with carefully neutral expressions. "Miss Kendrick," said the shorter one, removing his hat. He had a broad, flat face and kind eyes and was perhaps 45 years old. "I'm Frank Delgado. I've been the foreman here for 9 years. This is Cody Reed. He's been here 4." Cody was young, perhaps 20, with red hair and sunburned ears, and he nodded without quite meeting her eyes. "Mr. Delgado," Julia said, stepping down from the wagon with the same dignity she'd stepped down from the stagecoach. "I've read your letters. You've done well holding things together." "We're short-handed," Frank said, with a directness that was respectful but honest. "Elias had 6 men regular. After he passed, 2 of them moved on. We've got 3 others besides Cody and me, but the calving and the fence repairs along the north section, it's been tough going." "I understand," she said. "We'll address it. Can you see to my trunks?" Frank and Cody moved to the wagon, and Julia looked up at the house for a long moment, and Homer, who had come around the wagon to stand beside her, saw the way her jaw set and understood that she was composing herself before going inside for the first time, going into the house where her uncle had lived and died, and he said nothing at all, which was the right thing to do. She went inside. Homer stayed to help unload the trunks, and then he said good night to Frank and climbed back on the wagon. He drove the 4 miles home thinking about the woman in the silk dress, about the way she'd looked at the ranch without flinching, about the Boston accent and the white gloves and the college education, and the grief she was keeping under control with visible effort. He had known a great many women in his life, not in any scandalous sense, but in the ordinary sense of a man who moves through the world and pays attention, and he could not recall having met one who struck him so immediately as someone worth paying attention to. He told himself it was none of his business. He had his own cattle and his own land and his own considerable list of things that needed doing, and the affairs of the Circle K were not his concern beyond what he'd told Julia, that he owed Elias a debt of gratitude, and he'd paid it by giving her a ride. He believed himself, more or less, for about 3 days. On the 4th day he rode over to the Circle K with the excuse of returning a post-hole digger he'd borrowed from Elias months back and never quite gotten around to returning. He told himself it was just good manners. What he found when he arrived was Julia Kendrick standing in the middle of the near pasture in that same silk dress. The same one, or one equally impractical, trying to separate a calf from a fence post it had tangled itself around, while Frank Delgado watched from 10 feet away with the expression of a man who had been told to let the new boss try it herself, and wasn't sure if this was wisdom or disaster. The calf was small but determined, and the silk dress was already catastrophically dusty, and Julia had apparently lost one of the white gloves somewhere, and she was talking to the calf in a low, firm voice that was somewhere between instruction and negotiation. Homer stopped his horse and watched. The calf, after another 2 minutes of determined effort from Julia, gave up its argument with the fence post and bolted back toward its mother, and Julia straightened and pushed a loose strand of dark hair back from her face with her ungloved hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheekbone, and she looked at Frank and said, "There. Now let's talk about the north fence." Homer got down from his horse. She heard his boots in the grass and turned, and something crossed her face when she saw him, quick and complex, like weather moving through. She had been in Dust Creek 4 days, and the place was already changing her, and he could see it. "Mr. Boone," she said, with composure that was admirable given the smear on her cheek and the general state of the dress. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "I brought back Elias post-hole digger." "That's kind of you. She looked at the digger in his hand. "Do you know how to use it?" He looked at her. "That wasn't meant to be insulting," she said quickly, and something in her expression shifted toward honest. "I mean that I need fence posts set along the north section, and I only have 4 men, and they've been working 2 weeks without a full crew, and I'm trying to decide what to hire first, another hand or a full fence crew, and I don't know yet what's reasonable to pay for either." Homer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the north fence." They rode out together, just the two of them, on the excuse that Frank had other work and there was no reason to pull him away from it. The north fence was indeed in sorry shape 3 sections down, posts rotted through from an old season's flooding, and a stretch of a 1/4 mile that had never been properly strung in the first place. Homer rode it slowly, and Julia rode beside him on a gray mare named Pepper that Elias had kept, and that had apparently decided within the first 2 days that Julia was acceptable. "You can fix this with 2 good men and a week's work," Homer said, when they'd ridden the whole stretch. "I know a man in town, a fellow named Arturo Vega, who does fence work and has a brother who's looking for permanent ranch work. Both of them are honest and good at what they do." "How do you know them?" "Arturo helped me build my own south fence 2 years back. His brother Eduardo has worked at 3 ranches I know of, and every foreman speaks well of him." Julia nodded, filing this away. "What's the right wage for a permanent ranch hand in this territory?" he told her. She listened without writing it down, which impressed him. She was keeping it in her head. "And for the fence work?" He told her that too, along with the going rate for lumber and wire at the dry goods store and the hardware store in the next town over, which was cheaper by 20% if she sent someone with a wagon. She listened to all of it and then said, "You're very knowledgeable about the business of running a ranch." "I've been doing it for 7 years, he said. "My uncle trusted you," she said, not quite looking at him, looking instead at the distant mountains. "He mentioned you in his letters more than once. He said you were the most reliable man in Dusk Creek." Homer said nothing to that, because there was nothing useful to say. "I'm going to need help," Julia said then, and it clearly cost her something to say it, not much, because she wasn't a proud woman in the small way, but it was an admission she made carefully. "I know the theory of ranching from Elias' letters and from books I read before I came. I know what cattle need and I know what land needs, and I know how to read accounts and how to keep records and how to manage a budget. But I don't know this land and I don't know these people, and I've never done a single physical thing on a working ranch." She looked at him then directly, the way she had in the street on the first day. "I'll pay you for your time and your advice if you're willing to give it." He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the debt he owed Elias, and then he thought about how the debt had nothing to do with it. "You don't need to pay me," he said. "Elias was my neighbor and he was good to me, and his niece is my neighbor now. That's enough." She looked at him for a long time, and whatever she was deciding, she decided it. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Homer," he said. She seemed to consider this. "Julia," she said, and the word in the desert air was like something that had been waiting to be said. The days that followed were full and hard and full of the particular education that can only be gotten by doing. Julia Kendrick was not a fragile woman. She had that much already, whatever the dress suggested. She had the intelligence and the stubbornness that her uncle had spoken of, and she had a particular quality of attention that meant she learned things quickly when she saw them done once. But there was a great deal that the silk dress was preventing, in a practical sense, and after the 3rd day of trying to work alongside Frank Delgado in the morning inspection of the cattle, and coming away with the dress in worse and worse shape, she rode over to Homer's place in the late afternoon and she said flatly, "I need different clothes." He looked at her for a moment. He was in his own yard, working at the bench outside the barn, fixing a cinch strap that had cracked. He set it down. "The dry goods store in town has some practical things," he said. "I went yesterday," she said. "Mrs. Pierce was very kind, but the women's clothing there is not, it's not suited for ranch work. It's suited for women who stay indoors." He thought about this. He was a man who lived simply and had what he needed and nothing much more, but he had extra work shirts that had been bought when he was filling out and had never quite fit properly and had been hanging in the back of the wardrobe since. "Come inside," he said. He came out 2 minutes later with a folded shirt in his hand, a dark blue cotton work shirt, heavy fabric, made for hard use, with buttons up the front and a collar that folded down. It was made for a man, and it was made for someone with broader shoulders than Julia's, but it was solid and it was practical, and it would keep the sun off her arms, which had already started to burn despite the gloves. He handed it to her. She took it and looked at it for a moment. "It won't fit perfectly," he said, "but it'll do the work." She unfolded it and held it up and looked at it, and then she looked at him and she said, "Thank you." And the words were simple, but something had changed in the texture of them. Something was in them that hadn't been in the street in front of the stagecoach, some warmer register of meaning that they were both aware of. She rode back to the Circle K with the work shirt. The next morning she appeared in the yard wearing it over a pair of canvas trousers that she had apparently acquired from somewhere. She had thought ahead, it turned out, and ordered them by letter before she'd even left Boston, just in case, because she was that kind of woman, and her hair was braided back and pinned, and she had good boots on that were already starting to show the marks of actual use. And she looked, as Frank Delgado said to Cody Reed in a low voice beside the barn, like she meant business. She never put the silk dress back on. That is not quite true in the absolute sense. She kept the dresses carefully in the wardrobe in the upstairs bedroom that had been her uncle's guest room, wrapped in the tissue paper they'd traveled in. And on the one Sunday she attended church in the first month she wore a simpler dress, a dark gray wool one that was not impractical, only reserved for Sundays. But the silk and the taffeta and the extraordinary hat with the feather stayed in the wardrobe, and the woman who worked the Circle K from that day forward was a woman in canvas and cotton and leather boots with her hair put back. And she was never more beautiful to anyone who watched her than she was exactly like that, in the work clothes, in the morning light of the Nevada desert, knowing what she was doing and doing it without apology. Homer came by 3 mornings a week through that first month, and sometimes in the afternoons as well when the work required it, and they moved around each other in that way that two people who are paying close attention to each other will do, very polite, very careful, always finding one more practical reason to be in the same place. They hired Eduardo Vega, who was indeed everything Homer had promised: quiet, hardworking, skilled with both cattle and horses, and possessed of a dry humor that made Frank Delgado laugh, which was a thing Frank Delgado did not do easily. Arturo Vega fixed the north fence in 6 days, and Julia paid him fairly, and he went back to town, and apparently told everyone there that the new Kendrick woman knew what she was doing, because after that the men in the dry goods store and the hardware store treated her with considerably more straightforward respect than they had on her first visits. There were other adjustments. The books for the Circle K were in a state that required significant attention, not through dishonesty, but through Elia's particular system of record-keeping, which had made complete sense to Elia's and to no one else alive. Julia spent 3 evenings with the ledgers and emerged with a clear picture of where the ranch stood, which was not catastrophic but required some careful management. She had modest savings of her own, which she had brought in a small, locked case, and she deployed them strategically and without waste. She was not, Homer observed, a woman who panicked. She was a woman who thought. He found himself thinking about her a great deal in the hours when he wasn't at the Circle K. He found himself checking the distance between his east fence line and her west fence line more often than was strictly necessary for a man whose fences were in good repair. He found himself paying closer attention to the condition of the road between their properties, the ruts and the washouts, in a way that he did not pay attention to roads that did not lead to her. He was not a man who was unfamiliar with wanting things he was not sure he should want, but this was different from anything in his past, which had included a woman in Texas 7 years ago that he did not think about anymore. And this was different in ways that were hard to name, except to say that it was larger, the wanting, and cleaner somehow, without the complicated shadows of the other one. He told himself to be slow about it. There was a great deal she had to get through first, the grief for Elias, which surfaced sometimes in unexpected moments, the enormous practical task of learning to run the ranch, the 10,000 things that were unfamiliar about a life she had only read about. He told himself she needed the help he was giving her and did not need the complication of his feelings on top of it. He told himself to be patient. He was patient. He was exceedingly patient. He was patient for 6 weeks, which for a man of his particular quality of restraint was a significant accomplishment. The thing that happened at the end of the 6 weeks was not dramatic, in the way that the significant moments of real life often are not. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August of 1878, the heat pressing down flat and white over the valley, and they had spent the morning fixing a water trough that had cracked, and then the early afternoon checking the calves and moving the herd to the east pasture, where a thin scatter of late summer grass was still green near the creek. And now they were sitting on the top rail of the corral fence as the shadows began to lengthen, both of them watching the cattle settle, neither of them saying anything. And Julia had a smear of mud across her left cheekbone that was the same smear she'd had on the very first day, though of course she didn't know that's what he was thinking. He was sitting 6 inches from her on the fence rail, and he had been that close to her many times over 6 weeks, and it had never been a problem. And then suddenly it was a problem, because she said something small and quiet and funny about the particular expression on the face of the calf they'd been dealing with that day. A roan with an air of tremendous self-importance that Frank had named Senator, and he laughed, and she laughed. And when the laughter settled, she turned to look at him, and she was close. 6 inches close, and the light was doing the particular thing it does in the Nevada desert at the end of the afternoon, going gold and horizontal, and her dark eyes had something in them that he recognized because he'd been looking at it in the mirror and telling himself he was imagining it. He said, "Julia," she said, "I know," and she sounded like she'd been waiting to say it. He didn't kiss her, not then. He took her hand instead, which was the more honest thing, and they sat on the top rail of the corral fence in the last of the afternoon light and held hands like people who had been waiting to do exactly this. And the cattle moved slowly below them in the dust, and the mountains turned purple in the distance, and the sky went the color of a flame, and it was the most straightforward and inevitable thing either of them had felt in a very long time. Frank Delgado came around the corner of the barn 15 minutes later, registered the situation, and went silently back the way he had come. He said nothing to Cody Reed and Eduardo Vega about it that evening, but the following morning, when Julia came into the yard with her hair braided back, and Homer Boone's wagon visible coming down the road from the east, and the expression on her face like someone had taken the weight of arriving alone off her shoulders, Frank allowed himself a small private smile and said nothing at all. The courtship, if it could be called that in the formal sense, was nothing like what Julia had been raised to expect courtship to look like. There were no parlor calls and no chaperones and no formal presentations, because there was no parlor to speak of in the West, or at least not in Dust Creek, and chaperones were not a feature of the Nevada Territory in 1878, where people were generally too busy surviving to manage anyone else's romantic propriety. What there was instead was this. Homer came to the Circle K most mornings, and they worked through the morning together, and sometimes they rode out in the afternoons to check fences or move cattle, and sometimes they sat on the porch in the evenings and talked, and the talking was the thing that mattered most, because it turned out they had a great deal to say to each other. Homer talked about Texas, eventually, which surprised him. It surprised him not because he was secretive by nature, but because Texas was a place he had locked away, and he found that with Julia he was unlocking things without quite deciding to. He told her about growing up on a small, failing ranch in the hill country, about his father who was a good man but unlucky with land and weather, about his mother who had died when he was 12, about leaving at 19 with what he could carry, and making his way through New Mexico and Arizona and up into Nevada, working whatever came. He told her about buying the first small piece of land in Dust Creek with 3 years of saved wages, and then the next piece, and the slow, patient work of building something that was his. Julia told him about Boston, about the college that was one of the first in the country to properly educate women, and that she had attended for 2 years before her money ran out, about the literature and the history and the philosophy that she had loved, and that no one had expected her to be able to understand, about the library that had been the warmest place she knew in the years after her parents died, and she was living with a distant aunt who tolerated her without particularly wanting her there. She told him about Elias' letters, which had arrived twice a year like dispatches from another world, full of cattle and weather, and the particular beauty of the desert that Elias had loved with the uncomplicated wholeheartedness of a man who'd found his right place. She told him that she had felt her whole life like someone who had not yet arrived where they were supposed to be. She said it on the porch of the Circle K on a September evening, looking at the sky going dark, and Homer was in the chair beside her and he said, "And now?" She turned her head and looked at him and said, "Now I'm here." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand again, which was becoming a habit that neither of them wanted to stop. September was a busy month and October was busier still, with the fall work coming on, the calves to be weaned and sorted, the culls to be sold, the accounts to be settled before winter, and the preparations that the ranch needed to get through a Nevada high desert winter, which was not as severe as some but was serious enough to require attention. Julia worked every day, all day, and Homer worked beside her as often as he could, which was most days, because Eduardo Vega and Cody Reed had reached a comfortable rhythm of managing the daily work on Homer's property with only his occasional oversight, and he trusted them, and they were earning that trust. There was a moment in mid-October that shifted things again. They had ridden out to the far northwest corner of the Circle K to check on a small herd of heifers that Frank had been concerned about, and it had taken longer than expected. And by the time they turned back, the sky had gone from the afternoon blue to the green-gray that means weather coming fast. And before they'd gotten 2 miles toward home, the rain had started. Not the polite kind of rain, but the hard, sudden kind that the Nevada high desert produces in October, cold and driving and immediate. They made for a lined shack that Homer knew was in that section of the property, a small rough shelter that Elias had kept stocked for exactly this kind of situation. And they made it inside with the horses tied under the small overhang outside, and both of them soaked through in the way that rain gets you when there's nothing to be done about it. The lined shack was maybe 12 feet square, with a small iron stove and a wood box that was, thankfully, stocked, and a narrow bunk, and a shelf with some basic supplies. Homer got a fire started in the stove while Julia wrung water out of her braid, and within 10 minutes the small space was beginning to warm, and the rain was hammering on the tin roof in the particular way that makes any shelter feel more like home than it is. They sat on opposite ends of the narrow bunk, the only place to sit, and listened to the rain. "It'll pass in an hour," Homer said. "I know," she said. "I've learned to read this sky." She looked up at the low ceiling and listened to the rain. "Homer." "Yeah, what is it that you want?" She turned to look at him and she asked it straight, without any decoration, which was very much how she asked most things. "From your life, I mean." "From all of this." She gestured vaguely, which in the context of the narrow shelter meant the land and the work and the whole project of them both being here. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "A good piece of land that stays good," he said, "cattle that do well enough, and someone to build it with who gives a damn about it as much as I do." She was quiet for a moment. "I give a damn about it," she said. "This land." She said it with a certainty that had clearly been building for months, since the day she stepped off the stagecoach in the silk dress. I didn't expect to. I thought I would come here and manage it responsibly and perhaps sell it eventually and go back east. That's what I told myself, but I can't leave it now. It's mine, not just because Elia's left it to me. It's mine in a way I can feel. I know, he said, I could see it happening. You could, from about the third week, he said, when you started calling Senator by name. She laughed, the real laugh, not the polite one. He does have an extraordinary sense of his own importance. He gets it from Frank, Homer said. She laughed again, and then the laughter settled and the rain went on and the stove popped and hissed, and she said, I'm not going back east, Homer. He looked at her. I need you to know that, she said. Whatever happens, I'm staying. This is my home. He took her hand, and that had become the language between them, that gesture, the thing that said what the words hadn't quite gotten to yet. That's all I needed to know, he said. The rain stopped in an hour and 20 minutes, as he'd predicted, and the sky came out clean and washed and vivid with the last of the evening light. And they rode back to the ranch in the wet air with the sage smelling like it does after rain, which is the best smell in the territory. And they were both quietly happy in the way of people who have decided something important. He asked her to marry him in November, on a morning that had started like any other morning. He'd ridden over to the Circle K before the sun was quite fully up, and she was already in the yard, talking to Frank about the water supply in the East Trough, and she'd looked up when he rode in and given him that particular look that was only for him. And after Frank had gone off about the trough, and they were standing in the yard alone. He said it without any preamble because he was not a man for preamble. I want to marry you, Julia. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes. She was wearing the blue work shirt, his work shirt or one like it, and her hair was braided back, and there was already a smudge of something on the back of her hand. I know you do, she said. Is that a yes? That's a yes, she said, and the directness of it, the simple, clean certainty of it, was the most Julia Kendrick thing she had ever said. And he stepped forward and kissed her for the first time properly in the middle of the yard, with Senator the self-important roan calf watching from the fence and the mountains purple in the early morning, and the sky just beginning to do its best work. Frank Delgado, who had been watching from the barn door with his hat in his hand, put his hat back on his head and went to tell Cody Reed and Eduardo Vega, and the three of them had breakfast with very good spirits that morning. The wedding was held on a Saturday in December of 1878 at the small church at the far end of the main street of Dust Creek. The Reverend was a man named Caleb Marsh, who was also the school teacher, and who had, over the course of his time in Dust Creek, developed a talent for ceremonies of all kinds. The whole town came, which was not unusual for weddings in small western towns where entertainment was limited, and people were genuinely glad for the happiness of their neighbors. Mrs. Pierce from the dry goods store had helped Julia find white ribbon, and one of the women from town, a Mexican-American woman named Consuela Garza, who was married to the blacksmith and was the closest thing Dust Creek had to a seamstress, had helped her make the ceremony dress that she wore, a simple cream-colored wool dress that was nothing like the silk and taffeta in the wardrobe, but was entirely beautiful and entirely suited to a woman who worked the land and knew it. Homer wore his best shirt, which was dark and clean and had been pressed with genuine effort, and his hat was brushed, and his boots had been polished to something approaching respectability. Frank Delgado stood up with him, and the expression on Frank's broad, flat face was the most emotional expression anyone in Dust Creek had ever seen on it, which was saying something. Julia walked down the short aisle of the church without anyone to give her away, because there was no one appropriate to fill that role, and because she was 23 years old and had been managing her own life for 6 years, and found the metaphor of being given away by one man to another somewhat difficult to make peace with. And so she walked alone, which some of the older women in the congregation found irregular and which made Homer, who knew exactly what it meant about her, feel a particular quiet pride in the woman he was about to marry. They said their vows in the clear December light that came through the church windows and landed on both of them like something deliberately placed, and the congregation was very quiet during the vows, which was also saying something. Afterward, the celebration moved to the saloon, which was the largest public space in Dusk Creek, and which the owner, a wide, cheerful man named Hector Fry, had decorated with enthusiasm if not precision. Someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a guitar, and there was dancing, the kind of dancing that happens when people are genuinely happy and not performing happiness for an audience. Homer Boone, who was not a man who danced with his wife, and he was not good at it, but she was not much better, and they were both laughing by the end of the first song in a way that required holding on to each other for support, which was a fine reason to hold on. Frank Delgado danced with Consuela Garza's teenage daughter, who was too young for him in any romantic sense, but who was an excellent dancer, and dragged him onto the floor with the fearless initiative of a 15-year-old, who has already decided what she wants to do and is doing it. Eduardo Vega danced with the young woman who worked at the boarding house, a quiet girl named Rosa who had large brown eyes and a shy smile, and they danced 3 times, which was noticed by everyone including Rosa. The night went long in the best way, and then it was over, and Homer and Julia drove home in the cold December dark in his wagon, with the stars very bright over the desert and the temperature dropping fast, and they didn't say much on the drive because there wasn't much that needed saying, and when they got to the Circle K she said, "Your place or mine?" with the particular humor that was one of his favorite things about her, and he said, "We'll figure it out," and they both understood what that meant, which was that the question of 2 ranches would be answered in time, and for now the answer was here. They settled into the Circle K, which was the practical choice. The house was larger and the land was more extensive, and Frank Delgado and Eduardo Vega were already established there. Homer kept his own property too, of course, and Cody Reed managed it with increasing competence and moved permanently into the small house on Homer's land, which suited everyone. The 2 operations were not formally combined, but they worked cooperatively in the way that neighboring ranches with friendly relations always had in the West, sharing equipment and labor during the heavy seasons. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was not especially harsh by Nevada standards, but it was cold enough to matter, and there was a week in January when a storm pinned everyone down, and the horses needed extra care, and the cattle on the north section had to be moved to the better sheltered south pasture, and Julia and Homer and Frank and Eduardo and Cody spent 3 days in the cold and the mud and the wind doing what had to be done. And at the end of the 3 days they were all tired and dirty and satisfied, and Julia made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the 5 of them sat in the kitchen of the ranch house and drank it, and didn't say much because the work had said everything. Homer watched her across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this woman in the work shirt and the canvas trousers and the braided back hair, with her cold-reddened cheeks and her hands wrapped around the coffee mug, and he felt something so large and steady in his chest that he had to look away for a moment to let it settle. She looked up and caught him looking away, and she read the reason for it with the accuracy that she had developed for reading him over the months, and she said nothing, but her foot found his under the table and pressed against it, and that was enough. That was more than enough. Spring came to the Circle K in 1879 with the force that spring comes to the high desert, sudden and lavish after the winter's restraint, and Julia and Homer were both in the middle of it. The calving and the branding and the fence work and the spring rides to assess the range condition. She had been running the ranch for nearly a full year now, and she ran it well, with a combination of the knowledge she'd brought with her and the knowledge she'd accumulated in the hard daily school of actually doing it. And the Circle K was turning a respectable profit that Julia Kendrick would have been proud of. She had adjusted to the frontier in ways that were now complete and irreversible, but she had not abandoned everything that had made her who she was before she came. She kept books in the ranch house, good ones, and read in the evenings when the work was done. She kept up a correspondence with a woman she had known at college, a friend named Agnes who had married a lawyer in Philadelphia, and who wrote long letters about city life that Julia read with interest, but without the longing she might have felt a year earlier. She still took Sunday mornings for herself, walking out to the south pasture early before anyone else was up, just to be in the quiet with the sage and the sky. And Homer had learned not to offer to come on these walks because they were hers, and he respected that. There were injustices that the frontier did not apologize for, and Julia noticed them clearly. She noticed the way Eduardo Vega was paid less at the hardware store in the next town for work that cost more when a white man quoted it. And she noticed the way the Shoshone people whose ancestral land this had been were confined to a reservation that was getting smaller each year as the territory filled up with settlers and mining operations. And she said so, plainly and directly, to anyone who brought it up in her presence. In Dusk Creek, this put her slightly outside the mainstream of opinion, but not dangerously so. The West in 1878 and 1879 was a place where a woman who could run a ranch commanded a practical respect that overrode some portion of social disapproval. She hired where merit was, without discrimination of origin, and she paid fair wages and she kept her word and her accounts. And this was the kind of justice that a woman on a ranch in the Nevada Territory in 1879 was in a position to practice, and she practiced it deliberately. Homer, who had always operated on a similar instinct without quite having the language for it that Julia had from her education, found that being married to her sharpened his own thinking on these matters, and he found that he liked having them sharpened, that being challenged to think more precisely about fairness was a thing he had needed without knowing it. They argued sometimes as people who think carefully will, and their arguments were good ones, not destructive, not cruel, but real disagreements engaged with fully and resolved with equal fullness. Once in the early spring, they disagreed sharply about whether to sell 3 of the best calves to a buyer from California who was offering a good price but who Homer didn't trust. And the argument lasted 2 days and involved a great deal of frank talking in the kitchen and one evening of deliberate cold distance that they both found uncomfortable and quickly abandoned. In the end, the buyer turned out to be exactly what Homer's instinct had said, a man who tried to renegotiate the price on the day of the transaction, and Julia paid the transaction to the original number over his objection, and he paid, and she said nothing triumphant about it because that was not how she operated, and Homer said nothing about having been right, and they ate dinner that evening in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have proved something to each other and don't need it said aloud. In the late spring of 1879, Julia told Homer she was expecting a baby. She told him in the evening on the porch, in the particular way she had of saying important things directly and without decoration. "I'm expecting," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not quite seen before, a kind of undoing, a giving way of the careful composure he usually wore. And for a moment his face was entirely open and clear, and she saw everything that was in it, which was joy and something very like awe. He said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but nothing I can't manage. You should tell Frank that." "Homer," she said, and her voice was patient but firm, the voice she used when she needed him to stop organizing and just be with her. "I'm having a baby. I'm not ill. I've been reading everything Dr. Holloway has about it, and I'll see him next week, and the work I'm doing is not going to harm me. Plenty of women on the frontier work through a full pregnancy." He looked at her. He wanted very much to tell her to rest and to let him do more and to be careful, and he wanted this because he loved her, not because he thought her incapable and she knew the difference. And because she knew the difference, she let him say, "I just want you to be all right," without making it a battle. "I will be," she said. "We both will." He took her hand, the old gesture, the first gesture, the one that had started everything. "A family," he said, and the word in his voice was different from any word she'd heard him say, full and wondering, like a man naming something he'd stopped believing in. "A family," she agreed. The baby came in January of 1880, a boy, in the middle of a cold, still night with the stars hard and clear over the desert and the ranch house warm with lamplight. Dr. Holloway had come out from Dust Creek, and Consuela Garza, who had assisted at many births, was there as well. And Homer was outside the bedroom door for 4 of the longest hours of his life. And Frank Delgado sat with him in the kitchen and said nothing useful but was there, which was enough. The boy was born healthy and loud, and when Dr. Holloway opened the bedroom door and said, "Go on in," Homer went in, and Julia was sitting up against the pillows with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen before and would spend the rest of his life being grateful to have seen. She was holding the baby, who was red-faced and already quieting, and she looked up at Homer when he came in and said, "Come and meet him." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy, his son, the actual fact of his son, and found he had nothing useful to say, and Julia seemed to understand this because she didn't ask him to say anything, just shifted the baby slightly so that Homer could see his face properly. "He looks like Elias," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that was both grief and gladness, the bittersweet particular to people who love the dead and find them in the living. They named him Elias James Boone Elias for her uncle, James for Homer's father, which was a reconciliation of a kind, the naming of a child for a father who had been imperfect and unlucky, and who Homer had left without quite forgiving, and whom he was now, in the quiet of the cold January night with his wife and his son, forgiving. Elias James Boone was a sturdy, loud, opinionated child who grew into a sturdy, loud, opinionated toddler with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. And the ranch absorbed him the way ranches absorb children who are raised on them, with a thorough and total integration. He was in the yard before he could walk properly, scooting after Frank Delgado with a determination that made the foreman simultaneously exasperated and delighted. Frank Delgado did not stay solely Frank Delgado for much longer, as it happened. Eduardo Vega's brother Arturo, the fence worker, had a cousin who had come to Dust Creek in the fall of 1879 to visit, and had stayed on for reasons that included the dry goods work she'd found with Mrs. Pierce, and also, people suspected, the fact that Frank Delgado had been found in the vicinity of the dry goods store with unusual frequency during her first month there. The cousin's name was Maria Elena, and she was 38 years old, which was 2 years older than Frank, which Frank's dignity required him to be initially uncertain about, and which Maria Elena addressed by telling him that if he wanted to be foolish about 2 years, she had no time for it. They married in March of 1880, at the same church, with the same reverend, and Homer stood up with Frank this time, and Julia sat in the front pew with baby Elias on her lap, and the expression on Frank Delgado's face at the altar was the emotional expression that had been building since December 1878, finally arrived in full. The years of the early 1880s were the years when Dust Creek grew. The railroad came close enough in 1882 that a branch line was proposed, and when it arrived the following year the town changed, not into a city but into something more established. A second dry goods store, a proper hotel that replaced the boarding house, a better-equipped doctor's office, a school that had more than 15 students for the first time. The Boone operation, which is what people had started calling the combined Circle K and Homer's smaller property, was well positioned for the railroad and took advantage of it, moving cattle more efficiently and at better prices. And by 1883, the accounts that Julia kept with her characteristic precision showed a genuine prosperity that Julia Kendrick would have been proud of. There were harder things too, because this was the West and this was the 1880s, and not everything went well. In the summer of 1882, there was a drought that took the South pasture grass down to almost nothing and required them to sell more cattle than they wanted to and buy supplemental feed at a cost that cut deep into the season's margins. Homer and Julia spent those summer months managing the shortfall with the combination of Homer's instinct and Julia's numbers, and they came through it without catastrophe but without comfort. And the lesson of it, that the land's generosity was not guaranteed and had to be worked for and planned around and respected, was one they already knew, but that the summer wrote into them more deeply. There was also the matter of the mining operations that came into the hills north of Dusk Creek in 1882, bringing with them a rougher population and the associated complications, and a period of 3 months when the sheriff, a capable man named Garver who had been doing the job for 6 years, was stretched thin, and the general sense of order in the territory wobbled. There were 2 robberies on the road between Dusk Creek and the next town, and one night a group of drunk miners from the North Camp came into town in a destructive mood that required Garver, Homer, and 3 other ranchers to take the situation in hand with firm authority and minimum violence. Julia insisted on being part of that conversation in the aftermath, the town meeting at which people discussed what additional measures were needed, and she spoke plainly about the need for a proper town marshal separate from the territorial sheriff, and about the fact that the mining company operating in the North Hills had obligations to the community whose peace they were disrupting. And the men in the room received this from her without the dismissiveness that might have greeted a woman with less established standing in the town, because she had been in Dusk Creek for 4 years now, and she had run the most productive cattle operation in the county, and her word counted. The deputy that was appointed was a young man named Reese who took the job seriously, and the problem quieted over the following year, as the mining operations settled into a more stable pattern, and the roughest elements moved on to the next mining camp. In 1883, Julia was expecting again, and this time the mornings were harder and the fatigue was worse, and she did, grudgingly, allow Homer to take more of the outdoor work than usual through the first 4 months, though she managed the accounts and the ordering and the communications from the desk in the ranch office, and drove herself into town for the weekly provisions, and was generally not what anyone would have called resting. The second child was born in the spring of 1883, a girl this time, born on a May morning when the desert was in its brief brilliant bloom, and the air smelled of sage and something sweet that came and went, and she came into the world quieter than Elia's had come, taking her time, looking around with the composed interest of a person who intends to understand the situation before commenting on it. They named her Clara, for Homer's mother who had died when he was 12 and whom he had never stopped missing. Clara Boone grew up the quietest and most observant of people, with her father's pale gray-green eyes and her mother's hair, and her own particular quality of attention that was different from both her parents. Not the fierce, directed attention of Julia or the patient, watchful attention of Homer, but something finer, a kind of listening that encompassed everything and missed nothing. She was her father's shadow in the mornings, and her mother's companion in the evenings, and Frank Delgado's second favorite person after his wife. Elias, who was 3 years old when Clara was born, regarded her with initial suspicion that gave way within 2 weeks to the determined protective affection of an older brother who has decided this is his responsibility. He was 4 years old and quite serious about it. He told Senator the roan calf, who was now a large and still self-important steer, about the matter in detail. The summer of 1883 was good, the drought of 1882 passed and the range recovering well, and the Circle K had its best season in 5 years. Julia revised the account books in July with a particular quiet satisfaction and showed Homer the numbers over breakfast, and he looked at them and looked at her and said, "You're remarkable, do you know that?" And she said, "I know that the fences held and the calf's survival rate was up 11%. which was her version of the same thing. There was a woman who arrived in Dust Creek in the fall of 1883 who was in a situation that Julia recognized in certain ways. Her name was Helen March, no relation to the Reverend, and she had come from Missouri, widowed at 26 with a daughter of 4 and no family to speak of, looking for work or land or both. She was not arriving in a silk dress. She was arriving with almost nothing, and the particular courage of someone who has nothing and is still moving forward rather than back. Julia met her at the post office on a Thursday, where Helen was trying to understand something in a letter from the land office and looking like she might either ask for help or bolt, and Julia said, "Can I help?" with the directness that was characteristic, and Helen March looked up with eyes that were red from what might have been road dust or might have been the previous night and said, "I don't know yet." Julia took her to the Circle K for dinner that evening. Helen and her quiet daughter Rose, and Homer fed them both and asked nothing intrusive. And after the children were in bed, the 3 adults sat at the kitchen table and Julia said, "Tell me what you need." What Helen March needed was a place to start, and Julia and Homer gave her that, a small cabin on the north section of the Circle K that had been used for storage, which they cleared out and repaired over 2 weekends in October, and a job doing the ranch records and the correspondence, because Julia's growing family and the growing complexity of the operation meant she needed someone to share the paperwork. And Helen March had been a school teacher in Missouri and could write and figure as well as anyone. The wage was modest but honest, and the cabin was rent-free, and Helen accepted it with the dignified gratitude of a woman who knows the value of a true kindness. Rosa, Eduardo Vega's shy boarding house acquaintance from the December 1878 wedding, had by 1883 become Rosa Vega, as the 3 dances at the wedding had eventually resolved themselves into a courtship and a marriage in 1880, and she and Eduardo had a small house in town and 2 children, and Eduardo was still at the Circle K 5 days a week, and considered himself as much a fixture of the place as the barn. The community that had gathered around the Boone operation was not formally organized as anything, but it had the quality of something built deliberately, something that had been thought about. Julia thought about the fair wages and the honest dealing and the cabin for Helen March, and the way she paid Eduardo exactly what she would have paid any man of his skill, which was not nothing in a territory where that was not universal, and the way she kept her word to every person she dealt with. She thought about it because Elias had thought about it too. She knew from his letters, had believed that the way you ran a place was a kind of argument about how things should be, and she was making that argument every day. In 1885, a letter arrived from Agnes in Philadelphia, Julia's college friend, who had been writing for 6 years now with the faithful frequency of a good friendship. Agnes had heard from a mutual acquaintance that there was a new women's magazine in Boston that was looking for correspondent pieces about life in the West, and did Julia think she might write something? Agnes thought Julia's experience, a woman from the East running a cattle ranch in the Nevada Territory, was exactly the kind of story the modern reader might want. Julia showed the letter to Homer that evening, and he read it and looked up and said, "Will you do it?" She thought about it. She was 30 years old now and had been in the Nevada Territory for 7 years and had 2 children and a thriving cattle operation, and more daily demands on her time than the day had hours for. Writing was not something she'd done since college, not formally. She wrote the piece. She sat at the desk in the ranch office on 3 evenings when the children were in bed and Homer was reading in the next room, and she wrote about arriving on the stagecoach in the silk dress, about the work shirt, about the calf and the fence, and the way the desert light went at the end of the afternoon. She wrote about Elias and about Frank and about the north fence repair, and about Homer handing her the shirt, and she wrote about what it meant to find that a place could become yours more completely than a place you were born to, if the becoming was earned. The magazine published the piece in the spring of 1886, and it generated enough response that the editor asked for more, and Julia wrote 3 more pieces over the following year, which she enjoyed and which fit into the life without displacing it. She was not a writer who needed to be one, the way some people do. She was a writer who found it useful and satisfying and worth doing when there was something worth saying. Homer read each piece before she sent it, and his reading of them was one of the most valued things she knew, not the reading of a man who is being agreeable, but the reading of someone genuinely interested in what she was saying and how she was saying it, and he had opinions about it, good specific ones, and they were useful. The summer of 1886 brought the sort of event that makes a year stick in memory, one of those particular days that time marks for you. It was a July afternoon, the heat at its height, and Homer had gone out to the north pasture with Eduardo to check a section of fence that Eduardo had thought might be showing weakness, and Julia was in the yard with Elias, who was 6 now and ferociously interested in all mechanical things, when a rider came up the road from the direction of town moving fast, and Julia knew from the speed that it was not a social call. The rider was Cody Reed, who was 28 now and had been managing Homer's original property for 7 years with growing confidence, and who was not given to alarm. He reined up in the yard with his horse blowing hard and said, "There's been an accident at the north fence. Homer's horse went down. He's not seriously hurt, but he can't ride, and Eduardo sent me for the wagon." Julia had the horse hitched to the wagon in 8 minutes. She left Elias with strict instructions to stay in the yard, and went at the fastest safe pace the road allowed. And she found Homer sitting against a fence post with Eduardo crouching beside him, and his horse Bane standing nearby looking chastened. Homer had a bad cut on his leg from a fence wire, and his shoulder had taken the fall wrong, and he was pale under the sun-brown of his face, and there was a particular careful blankness of expression that Julia recognized as him managing pain. She got down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "Homer, I'm all right," he said, which she accepted as approximately true and which she also intended to verify completely. "Let me see the leg." He showed her. The cut was deep but clean, and she was already reaching for the kit she'd put in the wagon because she had thought ahead, because she always thought ahead. She cleaned the wound with the alcohol and bound it tight and helped him onto the wagon bed and drove back to the ranch, and he lay in the wagon and looked up at the sky and said, "I'm sorry, I know you don't need this." "What I need," she said without looking away from the road, "is for you not to be badly hurt. You appear to not be badly hurt. Everything else can be managed." She heard him exhale, a long, slow release of the pain and the tension of it. "You're going to be fine," she said, and it was said in the tone that had no question in it, the tone she used when something was decided. "Doctor." Holloway confirmed that the shoulder was bruised but not broken and the leg needed watching but would heal, and prescribed rest for a week, which Homer endured with the grumbling patience of a man who finds stillness difficult and whose wife found him, on the 3rd day of supposed rest, in the barn attempting to fix a saddle. "Homer," she said from the barn doorway. He looked up from the saddle. "I'm sitting down," he said. "You are sitting down in the barn fixing a saddle, which is not what Dr. Holloway meant." "My hands are fine," he said, with the reasonable logic of an unreasonable position. "It's just my shoulder and my leg." She came across the barn and took the saddle from him, and he let her take it because he was a man who knew which arguments he was going to win and which he wasn't. "Come sit on the porch," she said. "Elias wants to show you the thing he's been building." That turned out to be a highly ambitious and structurally uncertain birdhouse that Elias had been constructing from scrap wood, with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who has decided this is very important work. And Homer sat on the porch steps in the afternoon light and watched his son explain the engineering decisions with great seriousness, and found this a considerably better use of his enforced rest than sitting still had been without it. Clara, who was 3, sat in her father's lap during the presentation with her usual composed interest, asking the occasional precise question that Elias found either impressive or annoying depending on his mood. By the third week of August, Homer was back to full work, and the summer's accounts came in well and the herd was in good shape and the fall looked promising. In 1887, Homer's original property, the smaller ranch to the east, was formally incorporated into the Circle K operation. Cody Reed had earned the trust of 7 years, and Homer offered him the management of the south section of the expanded property at a partnership level that was not a gift, but was a recognition. And Cody Reed accepted it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has worked toward something patiently and sees it arrive. He was 29, and he had the focus and the competence that Homer had recognized in him from the beginning, and the expansion was good for everyone. Helen March had been at the Circle K 4 years by then, and her daughter Rose was 8 and ran through the yards with Clara Boone as if they'd been raised together, which in the ways that matter they had. Helen had quietly become essential to the operation, and her particular skill with the accounts and the ordering meant that Julia had more time for the work she liked best: the cattle, the land, the decisions about which direction to take the operation. Helen was not unhappy, but she was also not complete in the way Julia recognized, and the question of Helen's life past the cabin and the account books was one Julia thought about with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered to the people she cared for. The answer arrived somewhat under its own power in the form of Reverend Caleb Marsh, the schoolteacher reverend who had married both Julia and Homer and Frank and Maria Elena, who appeared at the Circle K one afternoon in the spring of 1888 on a pretext that was transparently about seeing how Helen March was getting on. He was 43, which was 15 years older than Helen, and Julia registered this with a slight concern. But then she looked at Helen's face when the Reverend came into the yard, and she looked at the Reverend's face and she thought, well, some things are their own argument. She kept her own counsel on it and watched to see what developed. And what developed was a slow and dignified courtship that involved the Reverend finding occasions to visit the Circle K with notable frequency and Helen finding the church in town worth attending with notable consistency. And by the fall of 1888, Reverend Marsh had asked Homer Boone for a conversation, which Homer had, with the particular frank directness of a man who takes his responsibility to the people in his care seriously, and at the end of which he had given an honest account of Helen March's situation and character and had said, "She's been through a great deal and she deserves to be treated accordingly." And the Reverend had said, "I know she has and I intend to," and Homer had believed him. They were married in November of 1888, Helen March and Caleb Marsh, at the church at the end of the street, and the whole town came again, and Julia stood up with Helen, and Homer sat in the front pew with 8-year-old Elias and 5-year-old Clara on either side of him, and the expression on his face watching the ceremony was the same expression he'd worn when they named the baby, the same full and wondering quality, the particular joy of a man who did not take good things for granted. The years moved through the way good years do, full and quick, leaving traces everywhere. Elias Boone at 10 was tall for his age, and already working alongside the men with the cattle, with the gravity of a boy who takes everything seriously, and the humor of a boy who has his mother's sharpness. Clara Boone at 7 was the reader of the family, with books stacked on every horizontal surface within her reach, and the quality of attention that had characterized her from infancy now directed at whatever she was reading, which by 7 included her mother's correspondence and the almanac, and on one memorable occasion, a legal document concerning a water rights dispute in the county that she had found on the ranch office desk, and that she had understood better than most adults might have. In 1890, when Elias was 10 and Clara was 7, Julia and Homer made the trip to the city, not Boston, but San Francisco, which had railroad access from the Nevada Territory, and which was a place neither of them had been, and which they had been discussing going to for 3 years and had not managed until Frank Delgado told them firmly that he had been running the ranch for 12 years and could manage it for 2 weeks without supervision. And Maria Elena told Julia the same thing with the particular warmth and authority that Maria Elena had developed for telling people things they needed to hear. San Francisco in 1890 was a revelation. Julia stood on the waterfront on the first morning and looked at the bay and the ships and the city that had grown up from gold rush chaos into something large and complicated. And she felt the pleasure of someone who has been away from cities long enough to find them interesting again, but who knows they are visiting, not arriving. Homer stood beside her and watched her face, and saw the Boston woman she had been, and the Nevada woman she was, and felt very clearly how completely both of those were who she was. She bought books. She bought 4 books at a bookshop on a steep street that required Homer to walk up it twice, because she could not decide, and then went back for the 4th one. And he carried the books without complaint, and with the private amusement of a man who knows exactly who he married. He bought a good bridle from a leather worker in the market district, and a toy horse carved from mahogany for Elias, and a small garnet brooch for Clara, and a length of blue ribbon that was close to the blue of the work shirt, though he didn't say that when he bought it. And when Julia asked what the ribbon was for, he said, "I thought you might want it," and she did. They were away for 11 days, which was the longest either of them had been away from the Circle K, and on the 11th day, sitting on the train as the desert came back out of the California hills and opened up into the Nevada flat, Julia said, "I'm ready to go home." And the word home had all the weight of something earned, something made, something that could not be taken away. The last decade of the century brought what they had worked toward, which was a life of sufficient and genuine richness. The Circle K had grown to a size and reputation in the county that made the Boone name synonymous with honest dealing and good cattle, and a kind of fair-minded stability that the territory, still in the process of becoming something civilized, valued highly. Homer was asked 3 times to run for county commissioner, and declined 3 times on the grounds that he was a rancher and not a politician. And the 3rd time Julia told him that he was a man who got things done, and the difference between that and a politician was exactly why people wanted him. And he thought about it for a month, and then said yes, and was elected in the spring of 1896, and took the work seriously with the same quality of patient, honest attention he gave to everything. Elias at 16 was working the full operation with the men, spending the summers on the range and the winters taking the schooling that had been available in Dust Creek since the improved school of 1883, and that he took in with the efficiency of someone who intends to use it. He had his Uncle Elias' name and his mother's drive and his father's steadiness, and the combination was a thing to see. He had also developed a particular interest in the water rights issue that Clara had been reading about at age 7, because water was the essential thing in the high desert, and the management of water was becoming increasingly complex as the territory filled up, and Elias Boone intended to be someone who understood it. Clara at 13 was reading everything and writing essays in her school notebooks that her teacher, who was by now the 3rd teacher Dust Creek had seen, brought to Julia's attention with the specific kind of admiration that teachers reserve for students who have exceeded what the curriculum asked for. Julia read the essays and felt the particular joy of a woman who had gone to college when women going to college was still unusual, and who was watching her daughter arrive at the same door, and she talked to Homer about it that evening, and Homer said, "She should go. Whatever it takes, she should go." They said this to Clara when she was 14, that whenever she was ready, there would be the means for her to attend a proper school, a college if she wanted and if she could get there. Clara listened to this with her characteristic composed attention and said, "I know, I've been planning for it," which was Clara entirely. Rose March, Helen's daughter, had grown into a young woman with her mother's quiet strength and her own particular ambitions that tended toward the medical, having spent enough time around Dr. Holloway's office to understand that this was a thing she wanted. She and Clara were still the closest of friends, and the two of them together were a combination of intellect and determination that people in Dust Creek sometimes found impressive and sometimes found a little alarming, depending on the situation. The spring of 1898 was when Elias, who was 18 now, came to his parents on the porch one evening and told them he had been offered a position with the County Water Board, which was a new body being established to manage the increasingly complicated question of water rights and irrigation in the county, and which required someone who understood both the ranching interests and the legal framework, and he'd been recommended by Commissioner Boone, which was his father, who had not told anyone at home that he had made the recommendation. "You didn't tell us," Julia said, looking at Homer. "It wasn't my news to tell," Homer said simply. "It was his." Elias looked between his parents with the expression of someone watching a conversation that has been going on for 20 years and is still finding new ground. "I want to take the position," he said. "I know it means I won't be running the range every day." "The range will be here," Homer said. "Do good work." And that was all that needed saying. Clara, at 15 in the fall of 1898, had written a letter to the Women's College in California, a new one, established in the decade since Julia's time at the Eastern School, good and rigorous, and had submitted the letter herself, without asking anyone to check it or improve it. And in November she received the answer that said yes, when she was ready, there was a place for her. Julia read the letter first, because Clara had brought it to her directly, and she held it for a moment before handing it back, and she said, "I am very proud of you." And Clara, who was 15 and composed and not given to demonstrations, hugged her mother with a completeness that said everything. Homer told the news that evening, sat for a moment with the same expression he'd had in the rain-washed line shack, and then he said, "She gets it from you." And Julia said, "She gets it from herself," and they were both right. In the fall of 1899, on the last evening of the last year of the decade, Homer and Julia sat on the porch of the Circle K as the sun went down over the desert and turned everything the color of the copper and gold that the land had always been capable of. And it was quiet in the way that the end of the year can be quiet, the way the end of something that has been full and good can settle into a particular stillness. Elias was in town, working late at the water board. Clara was in the house with a book. Frank and Maria Elena were in their own house on the south section, where they had moved 2 years ago into a proper house that Homer had helped Frank build over a summer of weekends, because Frank had been there long enough and had given enough that a house of his own on the land was the right thing. Eduardo and Rosa Vega were in town, where Eduardo had expanded his work to include management of the county's largest livestock auction, with the particular combination of skill and fair dealing that had always characterized him. Helen and Reverend Marsh were in their home beside the church where they had been for 11 years. Cody Reed was in his house on the east section and had been married for 3 years to a woman named Bate from the next town over who baked exceptional bread and had a fearless way with horses. The ranch was good. The land was good. The accounts were good. The children were good, growing into themselves, becoming who they were going to be. Julia was 44 years old in 1899 and had been in the Nevada Territory for 21 years. And in all those 21 years, she had never once regretted stepping off the stagecoach into the dust of Dust Creek, even in the months that had been hardest, even in the drought year, and the long cold winters, and the calving seasons that didn't go the way you wanted. She had found what she had come looking for, which she had not been able to name when she was looking for it, and which turned out to be work that mattered and land that was hers and a man who was her equal and children who made her glad every day, and a community of people she trusted and who trusted her. Homer was 50 years old in 1899, and he had gray at his temples that had been there for 5 years, and that Julia had told him once made him look distinguished, and that he had said made him look old, and that she had said were not mutually exclusive, and that he had conceded the point on. He was as broad through the shoulders as he had ever been, the work having never left him any other way, and his pale gray-green eyes were the same ones that had looked at her from under the wide-brimmed hat on the street in 1878, with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely not looking away. He looked at her the same way still. 21 years and 2 children, and the whole long work of a life, and he looked at her with the same quality of attention, as though she were still someone worth paying close attention to. She had told him once that she found it overwhelming sometimes to be looked at that way, and he had said that he couldn't help it, that she had always been worth looking at, and she had not had an answer to that. "What are you thinking about?" he said, on the porch in the last evening of the century. She turned to look at him, the way she had turned to look at him in so many particular moments, the fence rail and the lined shack and the church aisle and the wagon seat in the rain. "About the dress," she said. He smiled. The smile was still the same one, the slow one that took its time getting there and was worth waiting for. "It's still in the wardrobe," she said. "I checked last month. The tissue paper held. You're thinking about the dress on the last night of the century." "I'm thinking about the morning the stage came in," she corrected. "I was so frightened. I didn't show it, I hope, but I was. I had packed those trunks in Boston with the dress on top, and I thought, I'll arrive looking like I know what I'm doing, as if the right dress would convince the territory that I belonged there." He was quiet, listening. "And then you handed me the work shirt," she said, "and I put it on and something changed. I don't know if I can explain it exactly, but it was like the first real thing I'd done. It fit wrong and it smelled like the man who'd worn it before me, and it was everything I'd needed instead of everything I'd packed." "You'd outgrown the dress before you arrived," he said. "You just hadn't done the growing yet." She looked at him for a moment, and the desert behind him was all the colors it was capable of, the copper and the gold and the sage green and the purple, and the sky was going dark blue from the east with the first stars just beginning, and the night air was coming in with the sage smell that she had loved for 21 years. She reached across the space between the chairs and took his hand, the old gesture, the first gesture, the one that started everything. "Homer," she said. "Yeah." "I would do it again," she said, "all of it." He squeezed her hand, and the last light went, and the stars came up over the Nevada desert in their thousands, and the Circle K sat solid and warm in the darkness, its fences good and its cattle settled and its lights on in the windows, and inside it Clara Boone was reading, and Elias Boone was somewhere down the road doing the work of the next century, and Frank Delgado and Maria Elena were in their own house. And the whole gathered community of people who had built this particular place over 21 years was held in the darkness like something the desert had been waiting all along to shelter. Homer lifted Julia's hand and kissed the back of it, which he did sometimes, the old-fashioned gesture that always felt like something complete, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat in the dark on the porch of the ranch that had been hers and was now theirs, and would someday be Elias and maybe Clara's if Clara came back from the world she was going to see. And the new century was just over the horizon, and they were not afraid of it. The silk dress stayed in the wardrobe, carefully wrapped, for the rest of their lives not forgotten, but kept, the way you keep the thing that marks the beginning of who you became. And the work shirt, the blue cotton one that Homer had handed her on that afternoon in front of the ranch house with the post-hole digger in his hand, wore out eventually in the way all good work shirts do. And when it finally gave up past any further mending, Julia cut the least worn part of it into a small square and sewed it into the lining of the coat she wore on the range from that year forward. And it was there through the last years of the century and the new one coming, against her body as she rode. The frontier and the man and the beginning of it all, close and warm and permanent as the land itself.